just now to shift discussion for a minute, I really want to talk about Xinjiang, because that is having and is going to have an even greater impact potentially on business in the region. Maybe if we could take a step back, I'd love to hear your experiences, because you were, I think, were you the desk officer, or you had Xinjiang in your portfolio when you were posted in Beijing? Maybe give us a little bit of the history so we can understand why we are where we are today, and where China is today.
Sure. Well, I will offer my understanding. It's certainly not to seek to condone China's behavior, but just to try to set a baseline of how we got here. You are right, Steve. Thank you for pointing out I was the Xinjiang Reporting Officer in Embassy Beijing for 4 years, which allowed me the opportunity to travel to every corner of that beautiful part of the world and meet with people in Xinjiang. What has happened from Beijing's perspective is that there have been a series of incidents that have not garnered the same level of attention outside of China as they have inside, but that cumulatively have raised alarm in Beijing about ethnic nationalism and about the rising risk of domestic terrorism. There was an incident in Guangdong with Uyghur workers who got into a brawl with Han employees. That led to riots in Urumqi that grew out of control in 2009 and led to deaths, including of Han police officers. There was a mass stabbing incident at a train station in Kunming by alleged Uyghur perpetrators. But more troublingly for Xi Jinping, there was a bomb detonation in Urumqi on the day that he made his first trip there as General Secretary and President. This shook him in a personal way, because it raised questions about how so-called terrorists could get so close to his presidential motorcade with weapons. And then shortly thereafter, there was an incident in Tiananmen Square with a Uyghur family that drove a car into pedestrian bystanders and injured several. So you add all these pieces together, combine them with the Arab Spring providing a backdrop at the start of Xi's administration, and reports of Uyghurs traveling overseas to join terrorist organizations, and you have this narrative emerge inside the leadership in Beijing that there is growing risk to stability in Xinjiang and to Xinjiang remaining within the People's Republic. And the existential worry for the Chinese leadership is that if Xinjiang breaks away, what happens to Tibet, Inner Mongolia, et cetera. And that's the context by which they have decided to launch unprecedented efforts to assert control over all aspects of life in Xinjiang. There have been many detailed reports of involuntary detentions, as well as troubling reports of forced sterilization of women and other atrocities. And there also has been a massive surveillance network that has been built to monitor all aspects of life in Xinjiang. So I think that's sort of, in a sense, where we are today.
And the approach from the Trump administration, which the Biden administration has followed, has been sanctions. And that is, so Xinjiang, maybe you could talk about why sanctions. Do sanctions work? We've seen sanctions so far, I think, certainly on cotton. And Xinjiang produces about 80% of all of China's cotton, and China's about 25% of the world's cotton. So this is a real issue if you are sourcing cotton anywhere in the world. Obviously Nike and H&M are key issues, key companies have been in the news, but this goes well beyond that. So why sanctions, and is it working, do you think?
Well, sanctions are an available tool to policymakers that want to take action and take visible action that the public can see. Xinjiang has become a mainstream issue in the United States. It's something that my grandmother talks about with me. So that's my barometer of whether or not this is, escaped the China watching community. And I think that policymakers feel pressure to show action in responding to an issue that is really shaking the conscience of many people in the United States. Are they working? Are they effective? No, not if your metric is near-term changes to Chinese behavior. But I think that the theory of the case is to try to, over time, help the Chinese leadership realize that they are purchasing future problems, they are creating more trouble for themselves than they are solving problems, and that they can shift tactics to preserve and protect their interests as they define them in Xinjiang. My sense is that the coordinated announcement of sanctions by the United States, the EU, Canada, and a few others exceeded Beijing's expectations, and certainly got their attention. Whether or not it will have a material impact on the trajectory of Xinjiang, I think it's too early to tell. But I think that's really where we're at the moment.
And some of our clients are watching in the renewable space are watching this very closely, because 45% of the world's polysilicon comes from China, not comes from China, comes from Xinjiang. And if you sanction that, what's going to happen to the solar industry in across the entire world? Are you going to start needing to source from other places now, making sure that those raw materials aren't coming from Xinjiang? And I've got a friend of mine who says, well, China will just shift the manufacturing out of Xinjiang and go to another province. And I'm like, in the 100th anniversary year of the party, they're going to do that. So what do you think, Ryan? I mean, do you see, are people who are in the renewable solar sector, should they be worried? And do you think the internal politics of China, especially this year, maybe talk about the importance of this year, is going to prevent any type of reaction to that type of coordinated sanctions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting set of questions. On the first question about polysilicon, the honest answer is I don't know the future, but it's a tension between the climate imperatives of the Biden administration and the values and human rights imperatives of the Biden administration. My sense is that there will be increased pressure on the 4 major producers of polysilicon in Xinjiang to find ways to demonstrate that they are not producing with forced labor. There are other factories across China that are able to demonstrate and record that they're not operating with forced labor. If these major producers in Xinjiang are able to do so, perhaps that will create a bit more space for polysilicon production to continue at current levels. And if that becomes the case, then perhaps there's a model or a lesson that can be drawn and applied to other areas in Xinjiang. Because the concern that is triggering a lot of these sanctions is that the products are being produced with forced labor. On the broader question about what this year signifies, I think that this is a difficult year for the United States and others to be ratcheting up our concern about Xinjiang, because it's the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Next February is the hosting of the Beijing Olympics. And the Chinese leadership, at least as it's been explained to me, have interpreted for a domestic audience that external forces are using Xinjiang as a tool to try to tarnish the image of China on the world stage and degrade and undermine the Chinese Communist Party at home. And so their argument to their people is this isn't about facts on the ground. This is about efforts by the United States and others to do harm to China. And that matters because nationalism is becoming an increasing source of cohesion inside China that Xi Jinping and others are relying upon more and more, particularly as ideology has diminishing appeal outside of the 90 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese economy is in sort of a terminal state of slowdown, creating a little bit less performance legitimacy than perhaps it did in the past.